Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in the World Affairs Council Marin Chapter series of remote programs. Our webinar today is entitled Peace Without Palestinians, ? U.S. Policy in the Middle East. I'll get to make the introduction shortly, but first a few public service announcements. The World Affairs Council needs your money because the Council has been unable to stage the public programs, fundraising gatherings that it used to in the past because of the pandemic situation, and the fact that renters in the Council building down on Sutter Street can't pay their rent. There is a shortage of funds, and if you want the Council to continue, and if you wanted to continue supporting the Marin chapter, please contribute. Just dial up www.worldaffairs.org and click on donate, or another good way to make a contribution is to take out a membership. Now, today we'll have a Q&A session as we always do, and we will not do an oral Q&A. Questions, please submit them in writing under the Q&A prompt at the bottom of your screen. Chat will be disabled, raising hands will be disabled, etc., etc. Okay. Oh, yes, one other point. Mark your calendars. Our next program is scheduled for January 26th, same time, same station. The speaker will be Andrei Tsigankov, an old favorite of the chapters of University of California at San Francisco State, and he'll be talking about Putin's Russia. Now to get to today's program, our speaker is Professor Omar Dajani of the McGeorge Global Center for Business and Development, a law professor, however, at University of Pacific in Sacramento. Professor Dajani, I'm reading now, is recognized as a leading expert on legal aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In 1999, he was recruited to serve as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, ultimately participating in the summits at Camp David and Taba. He then joined the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, where he worked on peace-building initiatives and played a lead role in marshaling and organizing international efforts to support Palestinian legal and political reforms. Professor Dajani has continued since that time to work as a consultant on a variety of legal projects in the Middle East and elsewhere for the U.S. Department of State, among other institutions. We are fortunate, very, very fortunate to have such an experienced and so passionately committed to his subject speaker at our virtual podium. And thank you. And Omar, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Frank, for that gracious introduction and for inviting me to join all of you today. It's really a pleasure. I would like to speak about the Abraham Accords, but as I was preparing for this talk, I found myself thinking about a story that my father told me about my great-grandmother. She was the wife of an Ottoman judge. My great-grandfather was a judge in the Ottoman courts, and survived him after his death, becoming a powerful matriarch in the family, and also someone who ended up being very often turned to as a mediator in disputes of many kinds, including particularly marital disputes. And as the story goes, one of her nephews came to her because he was running into trouble. And what had happened, this was in the 1930s, is that he was having significant issues with his wife, and as a consequence, decided to take another one, which his first wife was not at all pleased about. And she became less pleased when she learned that his second wife was actually a Jewish woman. And so in 1930s Palestine, this took on all sorts of other dimensions. My great-grandmother apparently had a lot of advice to offer, but the one piece of advice that stands out in my mind that she offered to him was that the solution to one troubled marriage isn't usually a second one. And so as we turn to the Abraham Accords, I find my great-grandmother's words ringing in my ears. I'd like to start this afternoon by offering some nuts and bolts, sketching what the so-called Abraham Accords provide, how they came to pass, what interests appear to underlie them, and to what extent we can expect to see other states in the region follow a similar path. I'll then reflect a little on their broader implications, on whether these agreements are likely to have a positive effect on regional dynamics as a general matter, and in particular, what their implications are likely to be for the prospects of peace in Israel-Palestine. So as not to keep you too much in suspense, I confess that I am skeptical on both of those fronts. And I will conclude by trying to sketch out some alternative paths that I think have more promise. But let's start with what the Abraham Accords are. So on September 15th, 2020, as I suspect many of you saw, President Trump oversaw the signing of agreements between Israel and respectively the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The main event on that occasion was truly the agreement between Israel and the UAE. And it is a longer agreement than what was concluded with Bahrain and provides for the immediate establishment of peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization of bilateral ties between the two countries. And on top of that, they respectively commit to take the necessary steps to prevent terrorist or hostile activities against each other on or from their respective territories. And they also pledge cooperation in a wide variety of fields. This includes things from finance, investment, and trade to healthcare and technology, energy, agriculture, water, the environment, and in other areas. And by all accounts, the governments of both countries have plunged into making these commitments a reality in the last couple of months, moving forward to facilitate deals on many different levels. And you see a lot of coverage of these deals in the Israeli press these days, a little less, I would venture, in the Emirati press, a phenomenon that we might come back to talk about a little bit later on. Now, the agreement with Bahrain concluded in September was a little bit more tentative. In it, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Foreign Minister Abdul Latif al-Zayani agreed to establish full diplomatic relations, to promote lasting security, to eschew threats and the use of force, as well as advance coexistence in the culture of peace. And pursuant to those broad principles, they agreed on a roadmap of steps that they would be undertaking in ensuing months to solidify the accord and fortify their relationship with each other. And since September, and notably, even after President Trump appeared not to win re-election, Bahrain has moved forward with strengthening ties with Israel. Its foreign minister making a state visit to Israel in October and greenlighting the exchange of ambassadors between the two countries. At first blush, these developments seem enormously significant. No Arab state has formally made peace with Israel since Jordan's peace treaty in 1994. And that peace treaty followed the 1993 Declaration of Principles between Israel and the Palestinians, which to a very substantial extent opened the door for the normalization of relations between Israel and Jordan, which had long had covert ties, in ways that ongoing conflict with the Palestinians prior to that made difficult. In that respect, the situation that we see at present with Bahrain and the UAE present a very different set of circumstances. So what are the interests driving these developments? For Israel, the interests are pretty clear, if also diverse. One important interest is that this provides an opportunity to break Arab solidarity with respect to the question of support for the Palestinians, or at least opposition to normalization with Israel in the absence of peace with the Palestinians. Netanyahu made the point that what Israel has succeeded with these agreements in doing is replacing the long demand of land for peace with one instead simply of peace for peace, which he regarded as a signal achievement. But this also provided other kinds of benefits, both for Netanyahu and for Israel more broadly. For Netanyahu, it provided an opportunity to step back or step down delicately from a confrontation with a large segment of the international community with respect to his plans to transform Israel's de facto creeping annexation of West Bank territory into de jure annexation. And in addition to that, it contributed to Israel's goal of placing diplomatic pressure, particularly on Iran, though also to some extent on Turkey, by consolidating an alternative strategic bloc that in the light of day could play roles that it was unable to play at the covert level. Now, for the UAE and for Bahrain as well, the apprehensions that both states have felt about Iran's regional ambitions have also been a driver of improved relations with Israel. One Israeli analyst, Dani Citrinowicz, suggests that Israel is able to offer the UAE a range of benefits in terms of both soft power and hard power, from the possibility of more open joint diplomatic efforts, technological and economic cooperation, and even enhanced access to the Mediterranean, which might be important in the event that access to the Gulf were constrained in some way by Iran. And he also adds that this facilitates the carrying out of hard power options like cyber attacks on Iran and potential collaboration on attacking Iranian nuclear infrastructure sites, as well as for limited engagement with Iranian proxy forces in Iraq, Yemen, or Syria. And undoubtedly, these are part of a broader set of interests being contemplated. I would argue, though, that the UAE already enjoyed most of these benefits through its covert ties with Israel, which have been longstanding and have been growing, particularly in the last decade. and need not have entered into a peace agreement to achieve those things. Moreover, the UAE's relationship with Iran, while fraught, is not characterized by the degree of overt hostility that characterizes either Israel's or Saudi Arabia's. Now, Bahrain is differently situated on this front as a consequence of both its very close relationship with Saudi Arabia and also the Khalifa regime's resentment regarding Iranian support for Bahraini opposition groups, which represent the country's disempowered Shia majority. It seems to me that what is more likely than the possibility of confrontation with Iran driving the UAE's calculations are instead the things that a covert relationship would not have been able to secure for the UAE. And chief among these, in my view, is perhaps access to arms. And on this front, it is striking that the foreign leader lobbying hardest right now for Washington to green light the sale of, among other things, F-35 jets and Raytheon missiles to the UAE is Israel's ambassador to Washington, Ron Dermer. That said, the treaty also facilitates the UAE's access to Israeli cybersecurity technology, which the UAE has long sought and to some extent has already used, as has Saudi Arabia, but has expressed considerable interest in collaborating on the development of further technology in that area. And it helps to fortify the UAE's efforts both to remain an economic hub and to become even more of a political power broker in the region. So should we expect to see this circle of normalization with Israel grow? President Trump signaled that a raft of deals with other Arab states was just around the corner when this deal was first announced, though he did not make clear which states. And the list seems to have gone the way of his healthcare plan, which is that it seems not to have materialized. But there are more than a few candidates that have been discussed with excited anticipation, particularly in think tank circles in Washington and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. So Sudan is perhaps at the top of the list. The country's transitional government having been offered the benefit of being removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, as well as the prospect of receiving some economic assistance with the UAE in particular behind that, in exchange for normalization of relations with Israel and signing off on a more than $350 million settlement of claims brought by victims of the 1998 Al-Qaeda attacks on US embassies in East Africa. Now, this deal is apparently running into a little bit of trouble in Congress right now because the Democratic leadership has raised questions about whether Sudan should be granted sovereign immunity beyond the deal with the victims of the 1998 bombings. And how that will be resolved is yet to be determined. And indeed, whether it will be resolved before Trump leaves office is also yet to be determined. More on the benefits and liabilities of that in a moment. Observers also point to Oman, whose recently deceased leader, Sultan Qaboos, received Benjamin Netanyahu in Muscat in 2018. But to my mind, such a step seems at odds with Oman's long-standing posture of neutrality, while it has undertaken to build relations with a wide array of actors in the region, and really distinguishes itself for its breadth of contacts with actors in the region. It has also been careful not to take sides, and that is true not only in relation to Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, Oman maintaining some relations with each, but also in terms of the conflict in the Persian or Arabian Gulf. Oman has been careful not to disrupt the security balance to too great an extent, and has, with a lot of effort, cultivated a relationship of trust and confidence with Tehran, which I think it is careful about moving too far to destabilize, at least in the absence of very substantial incentives. And with the Trump administration leaving office, it's unclear whether those kinds of incentives are likely to be forthcoming. Saudi Arabia is also often pointed to as a prospect on this front. Saudi Arabia, too, seems differently situated than both the UAE and Bahrain on this front, both because broader internal political dynamics make this a much more risky enterprise for the monarchy than it would be for the monarchs in either of the smaller emirates, whose populations are smaller and comprised to a far greater extent of expatriate groups. But also because this seems to be a point of substantial contention within the royal family itself. And that bubbled to the top only this week or over the last couple of weeks in radically conflicting comments from two important Saudi leaders, two significant actors in the Saudi security establishment. Prince Faisal al-Turki, who is a former intelligence chief, and Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was Saudi Arabia's ambassador to Washington. And so it seems to me at least as likely that Saudi Arabia will continue to cultivate the benefits of its low-profile relationship with Israel, rather than moving toward a full normalization of relations, though we'll see. Two other states that get mentioned in this context are Morocco, which in February of 2020, American and Israeli media were suggesting was waiting in line to normalize relations with Israel, but whose king made clear in August that he had no intention of taking that step at this juncture, and who seems concerned about taking a step that would inflame domestic politics in Morocco. And that is particularly the case in view of the fact that intercommunal relations, Muslim-Jewish relations within the monarchy, have been peaceful, and there's little desire to move in that direction. And then finally, there's been some speculation about whether Lebanon, which badly needs a leg up following the economic crisis that it's been suffering for the last year, the political crisis that has exacerbated it, and the explosion that exacerbated it yet further. However, there too, the opposition of Hezbollah on that front seems likely to be a major impediment to Beirut taking this step, and at minimum seems likely to make this a destabilizing step were this to go forward. So all of that said, my assessment is that it seems unlikely that this circle of normalization is going to grow at a formal level, though it seems not only possible, but very likely that it will grow informally in coming years. So what are the implications of this, both with respect to regional dynamics and with respect to what I made the title of this talk, Peace in Israel-Palestine. So Israel's president, Reuven Rivlin, said recently that he really believes that the agreements could be a first step of finding the way of cooperation between Jews and Arabs in the region. And that's a question worth considering in detail. I'd like to just note at the outset that so far, what this seems to be producing as far as the broader region is concerned is not greater stability, but instead greater instability. Peter Beinart reflected very thoughtfully in Jewish Currents about the ways in which this can be understood as a sop to authoritarian tendencies, both in the UAE and in Bahrain, which is, after all, a minoritarian government, noting that in a region where sympathy for the Palestinian cause still runs deep, recognizing Israel elicits fierce popular opposition. And so in order to normalize relations, Israel's erstwhile Arab partners have to make an effort to quash domestic dissent. And that is exactly what has happened already in the UAE, with a number of arrests already having been made of those who expressed opposition to these agreements. With respect to the Sudan, former US State Department official Jeff Feltman, along with Peyton Knopf, also raised some concerns. They point out that Sudan is in an incredibly fragile transition at the moment, and suggest that if normalization is seen as resulting from exploitation of Sudan's economic and humanitarian desperation, it will be even more polarizing among the public, accelerate the erosion of support for the transition, and expose the Prime Minister to the machinations of those within Sudan who are opposed to reform, and ironically to the very regional actors that Israel and the UAE view as their primary adversaries. On top of all of this, Ezzedine Shukri Fisher, who is my former colleague, as well as former colleague of Peter Bartu, who I see is here in the room with us, argued in the Washington Post that if one pays attention to what the actual conflicts in the region are, in Yemen and Syria and Libya and Lebanon, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are supporting factions fighting those supported by Qatar, Turkey, and Iran. And the agreements between UAE and Bahrain and Israel don't bring us closer to ending any of these conflicts. If anything, as Dean argues, they're likely to deepen them further as the alliance between Israel, UAE, and Saudi Arabia against Iran, so far kept under the table, becomes more assertive. So as far as the broader regional constellation is concerned, there are worrying signals about what the implications of this could be. But what about with respect to Israel-Palestine? And this is where I'll end my remarks. Moshe Dayan famously remarked, if you want to make peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. And the fact of the matter is that in 2002, Saudi Arabia led the Arab League in proposing the Arab Peace Initiative, which provided that in exchange for full normalization of relations with all of the Arab world, Israel should commit to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with East Jerusalem as its capital, and a just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. The idea behind that, like the idea behind the Khartoum resolution 30 years ago, was that Israel needed an incentive to transform the status quo. And whether one thinks of normalization between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, and potentially a wider array of Arab states, as being something that could help to lead to peace with Palestinians, really depends on two things. The first is your understanding of what the situation on the ground is. And the second is what your theory of change is. Now, with respect to the situation on the ground, what we are presented with is a situation where at present you have almost the same number of Israelis and Palestinians living in the land between the Jordan Valley and the sea. Somewhere between 6.5 and 7 million of each. Now, among the Palestinians, there is a portion that have Israeli citizenship. And accordingly, that 1.4 million, roughly, Palestinians has the opportunity to participate in full, if occasionally also under facing discrimination in Israel's political system. And I mention discrimination here because it's important to bear in mind that Arab political parties in Israel have never been invited to join the governing coalitions that run the country. Even putting that to the side, however, what that means is that we continue to deal with a situation where roughly 5 million Palestinians living in their homeland are disenfranchised and are in a very substantial way a captive population. This is particularly true for the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and those who reside in the array of enclaves that Israel has created and enforces movement between, or regulates movement between in the West Bank. But it's also true to some extent for the residents of Jerusalem, Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, most of whom do not have Israeli citizenship. For years, the international community has recognized, or rather has countenanced, the fact that 5 million people exist in this predicament without political rights, with the expectation that that situation would be brought to an end rapidly by a peace agreement between the two sides. Now, I see frustratingly that I'm just about out of time, so I will be happy to speak to some of these questions in greater detail. But may I just take three, 4 more minutes to finish my remarks, Frank?
Hey, take as much time as you like.
Okay, great. But let me just make 2 last points. So the first is that the predicament that we're facing, what many have come to call a one-state reality, is one in which there is a single government, the government in Jerusalem, that is making all of the most meaningful decisions for all of the population in this space. And at a certain point, it becomes critical for us to take a decision about whether that is a predicament that we're prepared to continue to countenance. And so in order to think about how to go forward, you have to think about what your theory of change is. We have had many years now of Israel's allies, the United States, the European Union, indeed even Jordan and Egypt, undertaking through an array of means to reassure Israel that if it makes peace, it will achieve the security that it demands. And beyond that, they have all been reluctant to impose costs on Israel and Israelis for the perpetuation of the status quo. Indeed, we've seen Jordanian and Egyptian diplomats raise concerns about Israeli behavior in a range of circumstances, but the response from Jerusalem has been not to rein in those policies, but instead to tighten control on the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and as regards the West Bank, to take steps toward annexation of territory. And at present, roughly 60% of the West Bank, what is called Area C, remains to a substantial extent inaccessible to Palestinians from Palestinian cities and towns in the West Bank for purposes of access to agriculture and economic development, rendering the Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank captive economically as well as physically. To my mind, if the Biden administration is to undertake to find a way forward, what it needs to do is to articulate persuasively why a policy that has failed to work for 30 years is likely to work at this juncture, and why normalization of the kind that we've already seen with Egypt and with Jordan is likely to work in these circumstances when it hasn't worked so far. It's only out of concern for the time that I'll stop here, but I welcome your questions and comments and look forward to a continuing discussion, particularly about these last questions, which I fear I gave short shrift.
Well, splendid. Thank you for a marvelous talk. Please, audience, do submit your questions via Q&A. We only have one so far, but one question which was submitted to me in advance by David Guggenheim, and which you kind of somewhat answered in your concluding remarks, relates to what signs we are seeing from the Biden administration to be, so to speak. Will they rejoin UNRWA, for example? Who will be their ambassador, which will be to Israel, which will be a very key point. And well, just that in general. How do you see the Biden administration? Have they shown anything as to what their intentions are? And particularly, this is the point I wanted to add, they seem preoccupied with Iran. And if they're focused on the Middle East is anywhere, it's on Iran, it's not on Palestine and Israel. And if they make a deal with Iran, that is going to involve, from the Israeli standpoint, concessions by Israel to the United States. And so isn't that likely to make Israel's position on Palestine that much tougher? Anyway.
Those are great questions. I'll start off by saying I think that one thing the Biden team has made relatively clear is that they don't intend to privilege the Palestinian-Israeli peace process at the outset of the administration, out of concern both for domestic goals, which are a focus right now. Obviously, COVID looms largest on that front. But also out of concern for navigating through foreign policy concerns like the Iran nuclear deal. So what Biden has undertaken to do is, on the one hand, signal some readiness to reverse the Trump administration's offensive isolation of the Palestinian leadership, and cutting off of assistance to Palestinians, both through the Palestinian Authority and through the UN and UNRWA in particular. So we can expect to see Biden reestablish or allow the PLO to reestablish its representative office in Washington, to reestablish contacts with them, and to try to move toward a posture of conversation, of dialogue, and perhaps also undertake over time to rebuild the United States' very seriously tarnished reputation among Palestinians. But I would be surprised if they dedicated much effort to the so-called peace process. In part because I suspect they see little chance of a negotiated settlement of the conflict at present, with Trump's peace to prosperity plan on the table, and having elicited such a positive reaction from Netanyahu and such a negative reaction from the Palestinians. I think it would be difficult for Biden to re-enter that conversation at this juncture. So I think there will be a somewhat more distant, a chillier dynamic with Netanyahu, but a maintenance of warm relations with Israel and an attempt to try to bring the Palestinians more into the conversation.
Netanyahu seems like he's there forever. His power sharing agreement with Gantz, is that getting anywhere?
Well, it looks like Israel will go into elections again this year, and I'm not a specialist on Israeli politics, so I'm not well situated to opine on where the power sharing agreement will go. But what I will say is that I don't see a radical difference as far as relations with Palestinians between Gantz and Netanyahu. I think one of the tragedies of the last 20 years is that Israel's center and left have lost so much ground to the right. And you see this not only in the political establishment, but also among young people who skew more conservative in Israel than in any other industrialized and at least nominally democratic country that I can think of. And so I think when you look at the way in which Gantz has spoken about an array of issues, for example, addressing annexation as problematic from a public relations perspective, but not necessarily from a diplomatic perspective, I'm concerned that he shouldn't be regarded as a white knight on this front. And that's, I think, pointing in the direction of the need for us to identify other models for resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict than the model of bilateral negotiations under US sponsorship that has been advocated and embraced for such a long time.
Well, you're feeding right into the question that our mutual friend Smadar Ben Nathan is asking from Washington, and that is, what form of might future negotiations take? What might make them successful? And also, Mike Elgee, a fellow steering committee, Marin chapter steering committee member of mine, asks, negotiations towards what? What is the, if you will, final solution?
Yeah.
Bad pun, sorry.
Sure. So big and hard questions, but I'll try to take them in turn. And hello, Smadar. So nice to, although I don't see you, it's nice to see your name on the screen. At the outset, let me say, having participated in a number of rounds of Palestinian-Israeli peace talks, during a moment when peace seemed like an inevitable consequence of those talks, I can say that I with great sadness, I see very little prospect of a negotiated settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the foreseeable future. And the main reason for that, and here I'll own my bias as a former member of the Palestinian negotiating team, is that Israel faces few costs associated with maintaining the status quo. And although I know many Israelis, many Israelis who have a profound desire and wish for peace, I think the government has a greater desire for carrying out its territorial ambitions in the West Bank, and a profound reluctance to engage in the kind of meaningful power sharing in Israel-Palestine that is necessary for peace to occur. So the kind of negotiations that we thought would yield a peace agreement, to my mind, seem unlikely to, and to a great extent that's because of both Israel's power and the few costs Israelis feel a different continuing on this path involves. And so for that reason, I believe that even though the Biden administration has come out squarely against boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, that those who care about the cause of peace in Israel need to articulate how the Netanyahu government, which has faced less violence over the last 10 years than Israel has faced at almost any other time in its history. I mean, less violence coming from the West Bank in particular, and which has achieved broader normalization on the world stage than Israel has ever before, but nevertheless persists in the path of annexation. I think it's important to ask, how do you change that path other than by creating pressure? Having said all of that, and turning to the other question that Frank posed, I think that there is increasing room to explore alternative approaches to dealing with this problem. And I think that there are two broad paths that are promising and many more that are worrying. To my mind, the paths that are promising include legal strategies advanced by courageous human rights advocates like Sari Bashi, who is an Israeli human rights lawyer who is based in Ramallah and who formed an organization dedicated to freedom of movement in Israel-Palestine, and who has been advocating for transformation of Israeli law to ensure that, at least as regards the provision of economic and social rights, that Palestinians be fully enfranchised, that they receive full benefits, and arguing from a position of a demand for equality and within the framework of international human rights. And I think that that kind of legal strategy is going to be a long time in executing, but is built on the right kinds of values. I think equality is an unimpeachable value on the basis of which to think about a future for Israel-Palestine. Having said that, and this is the last thing I'll say in regard to this question, I'm not necessarily advocating a so-called one-state solution. To my mind, one of the most interesting developments of the last few years is the increased attention that's been given to confederal approaches to resolving this problem, in which you would have a sovereign Israel and a sovereign Palestine, but living together within a framework comparable to the Schengen framework that we see in Europe, or the Four Corners control, border control framework that we see in Central America. And those who would scoff at such arrangements and say, oh, are you kidding? We're talking about Israel-Palestine here, not Europe, should remember that both Europe and Central America were sites of both cold and hot conflict incredibly recently. And security arrangements can be conceived to address these kinds of questions where there is a will. But the will brings me back to the need for there to be nonviolent pressure asserted on Israel. I'm happy to take other questions if there are.
Yeah, well, one question that Molly Freeman has raised, and I may be paraphrasing a bit, is how about the Palestinian leadership? It hasn't, apparently, from what people tell me, been very successful. The leadership in Gaza, Hamas, I should say, and the Palestinian Authority don't seem to get along very well. Can they form a united front that is capable of negotiating successfully with the Israelis or in a more broad international framework?
So I think that the Palestinian leadership is facing a legitimacy crisis, both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And that legitimacy crisis in the West Bank is just to a great extent a consequence of the leadership's failure to translate its cooperation with Israel and its commitment to a two-state solution into a two-state solution that yields benefits for Palestinians on the ground. Though corruption has loomed as an issue as well in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. If you look at the polling that's been conducted, it's not the primary source of its legitimacy problems. Now, I think that were the government of Israel to take serious steps toward a peaceful overture, and to my mind, the framework that Jared Kushner and President Trump were endorsing earlier this year is not such a serious framework, and I'm glad to explain why in a moment, if people are interested. But I think were the Palestinians presented with the possibility of achieving a two-state solution that promised genuine freedom for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, meaningful sovereignty, and the opportunity to actually build a state, or for that matter, if there were some mechanism through which some other kind of arrangement could be advanced, I think this leadership could rise to the occasion. And although I think Abu Mazen is, Mahmoud Abbas is well past his prime, I think there are others in Palestinian political circles who have greater potential. And the Prime Minister is an example of a person of intelligence and integrity who has potential on that front. So the long and the short of it is that I guess what I'm saying is build it and they will come, which I realize doesn't sound like an easy answer for Israeli policymakers, or for that matter, American policymakers to embrace. But we can't lose sight of the fact that Palestinians are a captive and traumatized population. And it will be very difficult to find a leadership capable of managing these territories without trouble in the regime that continues to persist in them at present.
Well, my friend and Smadar's friend, Marina Parisinu. Marina, hi, glad you're participating. Would like to know whether you really think the Israelis want peace for the Palestinians, whether there's any real, and one thing I might just throw into that question is that on November 3rd, I don't know, a couple of months after the Abraham Accords, the Israelis entered a Palestinian village, destroyed, I don't know, 11 or 12 homes, left about 14, 15, 20 Palestinian children homeless. In other words, they weren't expanding the illegally occupied territory they've seized. They were just acting very badly within the territory that was occupied already. It doesn't suggest that their intentions, as Marina seems to be suggesting, will be particularly forthcoming as far as the Palestinians are concerned.
No, I think that I am sad to say I share Marina's assessment, and there are a few things to consider on this front. And I want to thank my my research assistant Daniel Michelson, who might be here in the room. I'm not sure, for some of the research he's been doing, looking at the array of approaches in the Israeli political spectrum to moving forward. And I'll say two things. The first is that it should be not lost on no one that after having argued that it was committed to peace, after having argued that the wall that was constructed in West Bank territory was not a violation of international law because it was not intended to be a land grab. And after having expressed willingness for years to engage in land for peace, that the Netanyahu government, the first opportunity that it had with an American administration that was prepared against our own obligations under international law of state responsibility to greenlight the acquisition of territory by force, which is a violation of the most fundamental norm of the United Nations, the order initiated by the UN Charter in 1945. The first opportunity Netanyahu got, he took steps to formalize a process of annexation that has been undertaken, has been going on for years, which gives you a pretty clear indication, I think, of his intentions. But I think it's also important to look at what others on Israel's dominant right wing are suggesting as their vision for peace. And I urge you to take some time to look through their proposals. Naftali Bennett suggests that a variation on the current status quo should continue indefinitely, with Israel annexing parts of Area C and Palestinians remaining in enclosed enclaves within Area A, which represents around 20% of the West Bank, and to some extent maybe Area B, another 20%, and allowed access to Israel only under special circumstances. And his is the most moderate of the proposals that are being suggested. We have a government that is comprised of legislators that today, in this day and age, are advocating transfer of civilians outside of the West Bank, which is a not very abstract euphemism for ethnic cleansing. And beyond that, just in the last few days, in addition to the assertive use of force against civilians and resulting in the death of a 15-year-old boy shot in the stomach with live ammunition just a couple of days ago, and the maiming, and Amira Haas, the Israeli journalist, wrote poignantly about this, the maiming of a young man in a demonstration who was not even throwing rocks at the time, by Israeli border patrol guards who then proceeded to celebrate the maiming of this kid. What you've got in this moment is a government that feels that there are no constraints on its ability to do what it pleases in the territory under its control. And that reminds me of something that arose in my career long before I became a lawyer or even had much of a sensibility as a Palestinian. I worked in advertising. And my agency, Leo Burnett, represented, among others, the Auto Safety Board, which did those seatbelt commercials. And one of the things that we discovered as we were working on a series of campaigns was that initially asking people to put their own seatbelts on was useless. That people are prepared to take a whole array of risks for themselves without real attention to their likely consequences. But what ended up being a game changer was coming on the slogan, "Buckle up the one you love," because when you care about someone, you prevent them from taking those risks. You push them not to do things that are against their own interest. And for those who are on this call who love Israel, I would implore you to buckle up the one you love, because at present, I think Israel's actions, which are animated by impunity, are leading it in a disastrous direction.
Okay. Well, thank you, Omar, and we've sort of reached the end of our time. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get everybody's question into the mix, but that's reflective of the interest in what you had to say, and there we are. I apologize. And remember, folks, next program is January 26th on Putin's Russia. And Omar, again, thank you for a very enlightening, fascinating talk. We are most grateful.
Thank you.
Good luck in the future.